Hi, this is Sean D'Souza from Psychotactics.com, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about working less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy your work and enjoy your vacation time.
You want a room for 150 people, is that correct? Yes, that's correct, I said. 150 people. And then I put the phone down. This is the 3-month vacation, and in today's episode we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to go back into the history of psychotactics. You know, we've been going since 2000. We had a silly name called $1 Million, which of course is really silly, but then in 2002 we changed it to Psychotactics. And by 2004 we were ready to do our first international workshop. This is the story of the Psychotactics workshop as they unfolded. It's quite a story. So there I was, trying to book a room for 150 people for our first ever workshop. I had watched other marketers fill up rooms with 1,500, maybe 2,000 people, and I figured, naively of course, that I could easily manage to sign up at least 150 folks. And if you know anything about workshops, you know one thing very quickly. You don't have a workshop, or you don't get to have a workshop unless you have a room. Because that's the first thing a client will ask. They always ask you, where are you going to host your workshop? And then they ask for the dates. And those dates need to be set in stone weeks, maybe months in advance. But it wasn't like we weren't prepared. We were so nervous about this event that it was critical that we planned about 6 months in advance. Now, it didn't help that I had never been to the U.S. before. So that was the first complication. But there was a second complication. At that time, I had an Indian passport. Now, I was already a permanent resident of New Zealand. But you don't get a Kiwi passport until you've been 5 years in the country. And so I still had my Indian passport. And the passport matters because with a New Zealand passport, I can just jump on any plane at 5 minutes' notice. With the Indian passport, I needed a visa. And this was the scariest thing of all. I was selling seats at a workshop, and I wasn't even sure I'd get a visa. It's not for want of trying. I got in touch with the American Embassy a few months in advance, but they didn't process visas that much in advance. All I could do was buy my ticket, get the requisite paperwork, then book an appointment to get the visa. And there was only one little glitch. They would let me know about the visa a week before I was due to travel. And that was only part of the problem. On the other front, we had the issue of signing up clients for the workshop. This, as you can tell, is no easy task. It was no easy task back then. The price of the workshop was $1,500 per person. That didn't include any meals, it didn't include any stay or travel cost. So if a client was to agree to come to the workshop, they would have to fly or drive to get to Los Angeles, which is where we were having the workshop. And it's safe to say that you'd end up spending another $500 to $750 on top of the price tag of the workshop itself. I somehow had to make this workshop too hard to miss. I had to make it enticing enough so that people would somehow decide they just had to be there. And so we did a free 16-week training course in advance. In case you didn't work it out already, that's 4 months of training, week after week. It kind of tells you how much in advance we were getting prepared. And every week we'd have an hour's worth of teleconferences. Each of the teleconferences had their own agenda and of course their own set of complications. The complications arose from not knowing how many people would show up on the call. Remember, it was 2004, and back then, if you had a teleconference, you had a lot of no-shows. But still, a lot of people would show up. When we announced the 16-week course, we got 2,000 people signing up to the free course. So should we book 500 teleconference lines, or 300, or 150? It was not only difficult to make a decision on the numbers, but also cost quite a substantial amount to reserve that many lines at a time. And don't forget, we were just starting out at Psychotactics. Every dollar was extremely precious. Throwing dollars on excess conference lines wasn't our idea of fun at all. So, very reluctantly, I booked 500 lines. And roughly 150 people showed up for the first call. So I slashed the teleconference numbers down to 150. Sometimes the call was packed to the brim and sometimes not. But I figured I wanted 150 people, and the most interested of the lot would show up anyway. And yes, we were recording the calls as well, so the number of downloads was still reasonably impressive. But if you looked at the operation from the outside, it looked like a well-oiled machine. Yet for us at Psychotactics, it was pretty rough. We were putting out fires on many fronts. One big front was the content that had to be drummed up week after week. On most weeks, I had no idea what we were going to cover next. And despite the fact it was free, customer expectations were sky high. We'd get dozens of emails asking for topics for all the calls. We'd get emails asking for the agenda of each call. People even asked for transcripts. And creating content week after week after week was only part of the problem. The other problem were our alliances. Frankly, I was scared. This was our first trip to the U.S. I had no idea where to go, what to do, and whom to trust. So I created some sort of alliance with some U.S.-based marketers. And that's where I made my first mistake. I asked them to book the conference room and the hotels on my behalf. Now, when you book the room, the hotel only deals with the person who's booked the room. Any changes you need to make have to be routed through that person who's made the booking. As you would expect, the hotel started dealing with the alliance. I was paying the bill, but they were making the decisions. They were calling the shots. The workshop hadn't even started, and the alliance was starting to get very sour. It was all my mistake. I was too inexperienced. And this inexperience showed, because when I got into an alliance with this group, they seemed very helpful. They assured us that they would help us. They wanted to be part of the workshop, and they would market our workshop to their list as well. They weren't interested in making any money, and I didn't think that was fair. If they were going to put in time, fly to the venue, market it, and even do some public relations, then they deserved to be paid. So I said that we would pay them a percentage of the profits. I forget how much. I think it was something like 20 or 30%. And so we got off to what seemed like a decent start. But looks can be deceiving. We were in trouble almost right away when deciding the number of teleconference lines. I wanted to have fewer and then ramp up the number as more people showed up. But he was adamant. We needed to have more lines. He said, "See how many people have signed up." And while I could see both sides of the picture, there was a hitch. He wasn't paying for anything, so if we had twice as many lines, I would end up paying twice as much. Now, remember, this is the year 2004, and teleconference lines are far more expensive than they are today. Even so, the trouble should have stopped there, but it didn't. The rooms, the venue, they were all booked in the alliance's name, even though I was paying the bill. At first, I thought I'd be able to attract huge numbers, but it soon became apparent that we'd only ever get about 20 to 30 people. Remember, we were brand new. This was just a year and a half after we started. Anyway, I called the hotel and asked them to change the room to a smaller size. It makes sense, doesn't it? You don't pay for a massive ballroom if you've got a smaller group. That didn't sit well with our alliance. He was furious that I changed the room without consulting him first. And this is the lesson that you have to learn when conducting workshops. The room always has to be booked in your name. Why? Because if the alliance decided to prevent me from having the room for whatever reason, I'd be in big trouble. I'd be at the venue if I ever got my visa, and he could effectively lock me out because he had made the booking. It was his room. Just when you think the worst is going to happen, it doesn't. Things turn out to be a lot better. We managed to sign up 25 people at $1,500 each. And the alliance brought about 6 or 7 of his clients. They didn't pay, but I was okay with that. I'll explain why later. And so we had a potential 30 or so people coming to the workshop. But there was still this issue of the American visa. Remember, we hadn't got it. So a week before we could get on the plane, we nervously went to the American embassy. And we walked out with our 10-year business and tourist visas. And then something completely unexpected happened. Pay Systems went bust. You see, Pay Systems was the merchant account that we were dealing with, and normally we didn't have a large amount due to us. Our clients would pay through the website, the payment would go to Pay Systems, who would then settle the bill by depositing it in our bank account. There was always a 15-day lag between the collection of the money by Pay Systems and then the deposit in the bank. So for 15 days, we were usually in limbo. As it happened, in the last 2 weeks before the workshop, many clients paid their amounts and for their food coupons through Pay Systems. So we had this concept of food coupons where people could buy their food. We don't do that anymore. Those were early days. But people had paid for it. And then Pay Systems went bust. I don't know how much we lost. I think it might have been $6,000. It might have been more. It wasn't just the money accumulated in those 2 weeks either. Merchant accounts routinely keep a small percentage of every transaction as a security. In case there's a chargeback or something that shows up, they can use that money. Well, guess what? They kept that little chunk of change every month, and so when the system went down, not only did we lose all of that money that we were collecting in the last 2 weeks, but everything that had been collecting for the last few months. So another couple of thousand probably went down as well. This was proving to be a regular roller coaster ride. And while at times it was very frustrating, it was also hugely exciting. There was nothing to do but stay on the roller coaster and make the best of the ride. In fact, to reduce the stress, we took a few extraordinary measures. One of those measures was to take all the touring binders with us, along with the printed covers. Yes, all the way from New Zealand. I know, it sounds insane. Imagine trying to get all those binders into a suitcase, because it doesn't fit in one suitcase. It takes 2 whole suitcases. And though a binder doesn't weigh much by itself, it really starts to add up once you put 30 or more of them in the suitcases. And so off we went on our epic trip to the US of A, non-stop to San Francisco. Why San Francisco? Why not Los Angeles? My wife's sister Audrey used to live near Campbell, which is a town near San Jose. And we needed some time to get used to things. We needed to get over any jet lag that we were going to run into. Plus, we had to do a fair number of things before the workshop began. Some of these things included getting the notes printed, making sure the audio guy knew what to do, all of these little things that needed to be cleaned up before we landed up in Los Angeles. It's really nice to arrive at a destination and have someone waiting for you. Having Audrey and Mangesh, her husband, waiting for us was a real blessing. We walked into the chauffeur-driven setup. If we wanted to go here, there, or anywhere, they would willingly drive us around. We didn't have to work out how to get an internet connection. We just walked into their home and connected to their Wi-Fi. The fridge was loaded with more food than we could possibly eat. And as we settled into the California lifestyle, our days were filled with endless wine, rum, margaritas, and massively sized chip packets. All the food was jumbo-sized, at least by New Zealand standards. Once the partying stopped, it was time to get back to work. We didn't know what to expect in Los Angeles. After all, we were arriving there just days before the event, so we decided to print out all the sets of notes at the local Kinko's. Kinko is a stationery chain in the U.S. It's now called FedEx Kinko's. But remember, we had 2-ring binders. Well, it seems that the U.S. had 3-ring binders. And while we got to Kinko's to photocopy the set of notes, we forgot to tell them that they would go in 2-ring binders. As you can imagine, they had to work out a system to get it into our binder system, and then all of that cost an additional amount of money. But yes, they worked it out, and they got it into our 2-ring binders. But the nuttiness wasn't over yet. We decided not to fly, not to drive, but to get on a Greyhound bus. Why Greyhound? Why not just hire a nice car and drive up to Los Angeles, or at least take a flight? I don't know what possessed me, but as a child I had brochures and booklets about Greyhound. And for some weird reason, I wanted to get on a Greyhound. This presented a whole bunch of new and unwanted problems. The trip itself was fine. It was getting to a Greyhound station and then from there to get to the hotel that was the drama in itself. The Greyhound bus station was far from everything. Of course, at the San Jose side of things, it was easy enough. Audrey dropped us off, and the trip was very pleasant. But by the time we got to Los Angeles, we were quite edgy. I went off to get a cab or a shuttle, and some guy kept pestering Renuka. Nothing too dramatic, but she was glad when I got back. I can't exactly remember how we got to the hotel, but it was some crazy route that involved Los Angeles Airport. I know this because I think we saw Los Angeles Airport about 5 or 6 times while we were in that city. I can tell you I was nervous. Earlier I mentioned that this was our first workshop. It wasn't. I had done workshops in New Zealand. Yet somehow I expected the Americans to be different. I cannot explain what I expected. But I was nervous despite the fact that no one could see it. I wasn't sure how things would turn out and where we'd run into our next hurdle. Anyway, we got to the hotel, we found our room, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was clean, neat, very nice bed. And then we opened the drapes. And there it was, the most welcoming sign of all. It said, Air New Zealand. Our room was facing what seemed to be some sort of Air New Zealand building. And instantly a smile crept on my face. I could see that things were really going to swing our way from here on. It's funny, eh? Little things calm you down. Under different circumstances, I could have seen that sign and not be in the slightest bit interested. And here it was, a simple sign acting like a lighthouse on what I perceived to be a very stormy night. Stormy? It was balmy. From then on, almost nothing went wrong. The biggest drama of the next few days was the Atkins diet. You remember the diet, don't you? Apparently, this new diet was out and people were gobbling protein instead of carbohydrates. And the hotel's breakfast was too carb-based. But it wasn't really my problem. It was the hotel's problem. We used to serve meals at our workshops in the past, and a muffin at breakfast, some lunch, and then some coffees through the day. And you may never realize it when you do a workshop, but these meals eat into your bottom line like you can't imagine. What's worse is that the feedback then switches to food. So when you cater and ask someone about the workshop, they invariably have something to say about the food. If the food isn't up to their mark and they're on some crazy diet, then you'll find that they have all sorts of holes to pick. So what you've gone and done is reduce the impact of their workshop experience. And that's because you catered for it. So long story short, no catering. This was the last workshop we ever catered for. Truly speaking, it wasn't catering. The participants had bought their meal coupons and they were using them accordingly. But we were still being bugged with the catering issues. Other than food, we had some minor hiccups. But just while we're on food, remember, if you're ever having a workshop, you have to consider this factor of food. It's very easy to lose a lot of money just on this food factor. For instance, you can spend about $1,000 on just coffee for a 3-day workshop for just 30 people. Very small additions of meals or cookies can add up considerably. It may sound petty to worry about expenses, but you have to remember why you're in business. You're in business to make a profit. You don't spend months ramping up to a workshop, then do the workshop, and then find out you've lost money because you catered so well. Catering can absolutely eat into your profit and leave you in the red. So the simple solution is no food. Find a venue which has plenty of food and restaurants around, and then let the participants find their own food. They don't overeat, and so they stay awake in the afternoon sessions, and there's no grumbling. And you don't go home broke, and that's a happy story. So that's just a little footnote in the middle of this tantalizing story. So we were done with the workshop in Los Angeles. We'd planned to go east, heading to Chicago, where we were going to do some speaking engagements, and then to New York, Florida, New Orleans, before heading back to California. Chicago was a good stop because we got to see the city for the first time, and we really liked it. Except that the speaking engagements were all over the place. At one event, I spoke to a group of business owners. At another event, to some folks in real estate investing. Both went incredibly well, but none of them paid any dividends, and there's a lesson here, of course. If you want to do free speaking engagements, pick them carefully. It might seem obvious to you that you need to speak to the right audience, but when you're starting out, you clutch at any straws. And in the process, you'll speak to audiences that simply have no need for your product or service. Now, this isn't a waste by any stretch of the imagination. Every speaking engagement is worth its weight in gold. You know how some idiot coined up the term, people fear speaking more than death? Well, the big reason for the fear is just a lack of practice. You have to speak to all kinds of audiences. If you keep speaking on a consistent basis, the fear does go away. And if it doesn't go away, there are some EFT techniques that will help you relax and make the fear go away. But I'm digressing. Let's get back to the story. So there we were, headed east and then onto this grand tour of the U.S. until a hurricane stopped us in our tracks. We did our sightseeing in New York, taking a nice break in New Jersey, and then we planned to head to Florida. And when we looked around, we were the only ones heading in that direction. Everyone else was heading away from Florida. So we avoided the hurricane, we changed our plans, we did a little detour, we met an old acquaintance in Washington, D.C., and then we headed back to California. And good thing too, because we'd have been in a lot of trouble if we hadn't turned around. We'd recorded the workshop in California, and we'd promised that there'd be a recording for those who paid for the recording. Well, all hell broke loose when we got back. The guy who recorded the sound was then going to edit everything, and we found out that he was spending hours trying to get rid of all the ums and ahs from the recording. And back then in 2004, I had a lot of ums and ahs. I don't now, but back then he was trying to edit every single and ah. And as he edited, he kept track of time. And then the bill for the recording went up considerably. At one point in time, he also decided to put in some opening music to each audio. No problem there, until we realized that he wanted to charge a royalty on every copy we ever sold. Yes, in perpetuity, forever. He was going to charge us royalty. It was time to pick up the credit card, buy some royalty-free audio, and put it in the recording. And at least that fire was put out. But there was still the issue of listening to every audio file. This activity had to be done because we had to put the content details and the timestamp on the CDs. We had CDs back then. So we needed to know which files were going on which CD, do the design of the CD, and there was this tiny issue of paying our strategic alliance what we had promised them, which was all very fine, except they insisted on an item-by-item costing. So there we were, having to dig up every single payment that we had made and present it to the alliances, when in fact we were paying them from our profits. They hadn't brought in a single paying customer, and they hadn't done any of the PR that they had promised us. They hadn't complied with any of that stuff. So we were paying them from the profits made as a result of selling to our own list. Anyway, Renuka is a bit of a maniac when it comes to paperwork, and she had stored everything, including the cost of a single staple. So we had the information needed, but it was still very frustrating to have to give this silly account when we shouldn't have to do anything like this at all. We were not in Florida, we were not in New Orleans, and we had a couple of months in California. So we ate and we drank and we ate and we drank and we ate and drank some more, until it was time to leave and get back to New Zealand. No Greyhound this time, just good old Air New Zealand. So what's the moral of the story? Every workshop has three components: the pre-sale, the workshop itself, and at least a week or maybe 2 weeks of post-workshop stuff. Taking into consideration all of these factors is pretty important because it takes the stress off you. We got lucky with that hurricane. If we had not turned around, we'd not gone back, we'd have to drag all the work back to New Zealand, and then several months later we'd have been even more stressed. Now, this was the first time we were doing a 3-month vacation as well, and we assumed that it was okay to take 3 whole months off. 3 months back-to-back is crazy. About 4 weeks is just fine. But here we had 3 months, and we had been traveling for over a month. So in effect, we had finished our vacation and we were going back to work in California. And that hurricane made us go back. Otherwise, we'd have all this extra work for no reason. We were able to tidy up the good, bad, and nasty bits while we were still in the U.S. And that was International Workshop number 1. There wasn't going to be another workshop until 2006. Amazing as it may sound, that workshop wasn't even planned. It was just something I thought up one fine day in February. And yes, there's a story in that one too. And you'll find out soon enough. So, did you like that story? If you did, write in and let me know, because there's a lot of stories that we have about how we started up in our sales, how we did our first presentations. There are lots of these very big mega stories that probably could be of use to you and help you so that you know that you're not alone, that this is not just happening to you. And if you're doing a workshop, you can prepare for situations like this. If you like that story, email me at sean@psychotactics.com. I won't be checking Twitter or Facebook while we're away because we'll be in Morocco on vacation. But send it to me when I get back. I'll have a look. Otherwise, just email me. If you have any questions about what happened at the event or after the event, well, send those as well. If you've been binge listening to this podcast, then you're probably on the last week of 2015. As the year winds down, it's probably a good idea to pick up that copy of the Brain Audit. You probably got it already. Read it again. It's very useful for a whole bunch of things, from your sales letters to the emails. Just read it again. It's really cool. And we'd like to see you in 5000 BC in 2016. We have a lot of new plans for 5000 BC. And that also gives you access to workshops that we have in the future and courses online, like the article writing course and the cartooning course. You get first preference. That's me, Sean D'Souza, saying bye for now and see you in 2016. Bye-bye.